Hello, everyone. My name is Rahul Verma. I work at the Center for Policy Research. Thank you for joining us today. This is the ninth edition of How India Votes series. The promise, as I always do, overpromise. I have overpromised that I'll do 24 such conversations in the run-up to 2024 election. And the idea is to understand how Indians vote, trying to sort of like create a body of information or conversation on these questions. And each of these conversation is going to look one particular theme or one particular question. And so the conversation today would focus on, do foreign policy issues and national security questions matter for Indian voter at the time of elections? And just to warn you in advance, both my panelists were very sort of like, I wouldn't use the term nervous, but they were not willing to join for this conversation, saying that, we don't have any body of work. What are we going to talk? It would be just a pontification. But and thank you to them. They got convinced that we'll use this as a platform to discuss and generate hypotheses, and will depend a lot on some of you who are in the audience. And I'll request you to ask questions, not just as questions, post comment. So it also makes us to think. It is true that, like if you think about Indian politics of 75 years, at least half of our national elections have happened at the time of war or serious security crisis. The 62 election, the 71 election, the 98 election, or 99 election, or the 2019 election. So you can actually, like, these were all sort of like warlike situation elections. Then there were other national security issues at the time of 67 elections, at the time of 89, 91 election. So you could think of most of our elections taking place at the time of national crisis and security crisis, but we haven't deeply thought about this question, whether it affects a substantial segment of Indian population or not. And so what we are going to do today is to draw on the comparative literature, because there is a lot of word, at least in the US context and also in the Western European context, about how national security and foreign policy issues do drive voting choices. And we're going to discuss some of that. The second element, looking this sort of like comparative lens and historical lens, thinking about India, because for a long time, it seemed foreign policy to most of us was how India dealt with Pakistan. But recently, it could be like another country could be included, is China in that case, which is more from a national security prism. But India is trying to sort of like renegotiate its position in the changing world order. And at least since 2014 and post 2019, and now India hosting the G20 summit, there's a lot of projection from the government about India's image in the world. And constantly in the surveys, we have seen voters crediting Prime Minister Modi with improving India's image in the world. And you will hear these conversations that the value of Indian passport have gone up. And so do these things actually matter at the time of elections, or these are side conversations and have nothing to do with elections? And ultimately, elections boil down to identity issues, ideological platforms, and material incentives that politicians and voters offer. So these are the two driving questions for the conversation. And then we'll try to think, given the G20 summit, continuous projection of India on the global stage, and the recent Israel-Palestine crisis, can any of these things spill over in shaping the 2024 narrative for any of the parties, be it the BJP-led NDA alliance or the Congress-led India alliance? To discuss this, I am joined by two very distinguished panelists. Both are good friends. Let me introduce you to them. You might know them well. Paul Stanlett, he's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Paul has authored two very important books. The first book, Networks of Rebellion, Explaining Insurgent Cohesion and Collapse, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2014. And the second book, Ordering Violence, Explaining Armed Group State Armed Group State Relations from a Conflict to Cooperation, again published by Cornell in 2021. And he's working on his third project. Paul, thank you for joining us
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Milan is our second panelist. Milan Vaishno. He's a senior fellow and director of South Asia program. And he also hosts the Grand Tamasha podcast at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Milan has authored the very famous When Crime Pays. Actually, I was teaching something today and I used a bit of the how criminality and electoral market interact. The When Crime Pays also won the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay New India Foundation Book Prize for the best non-fiction book on contemporary India. He co-edited Cost of Democracy with Devesh Kapoor and India Rethinking Public Institutions in India with Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Devesh Kapoor. Milan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rahul. At the risk of hijacking the chair's prerogative, let me just first, on behalf of Paul and myself, thank you and congratulate CPR. Some people may not know that you are celebrating your 50th anniversary. I think the actual day has just happened. On behalf of all of us, including everyone who is listening, I want to say congratulations and thank you for everything you're doing. We know that it's been a rather difficult year, 18 months, but it's great that you continue to be a resource for people who care about Indian politics and policy. So it's great to see that you're doing this series, and we're happy to contribute in a very meager and modest way.
No, thank you, Milan. Crisis also creates opportunities, as our Prime Minister has said. So hoping that the current crisis at CPR is going to help us innovate and also think in new ways about Indian politics and voting behavior in India. So thank you both for joining us today. What we're going to do is I'll invite Paul to first reflect on the comparative literature, what we actually know about how foreign policy and national security issues play a role in shaping voting behavior. And does it affect a large segment, small segment? Under what conditions do they do this kind of thing? Because we have the literature on rally around the flag in the American context. I'm not sure whether it is applicable or not applicable to the Indian context. So just drawing on the comparative literature, and then I'll invite Milan.
Great, thank you. So my remarks will be drawn from two kind of projects that I'm familiar with, or that I've been part of, I should say, hopefully familiar with them. One is kind of a more comparative, conceptual way of thinking about how foreign policy does and doesn't enter into kind of mainstream politics in the form of electoral campaigning, political mobilization, so kind of the domestic politics of foreign policy. The other is an India-specific project on public opinion that I've been doing with a professor at Florida State University named Aidan Milliffe for about too long, maybe 4 years now. And we're trying to write a short book about it now, in which we look at a set of historical surveys in India that were done by the Indian Institute of Public Opinion in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the mid-late 1980s. And then we kind of joined that with much more recent contemporary survey work from the kind of post-2006 period. Primarily on how Indians view other major powers, India, the United States, Russia / the USSR, and China. So I can talk about kind of the data piece and kind of what things we seem to think we might be finding about India with a lot of caveats, and then the kind of broader like international relations, foreign policy literature. So let me start with the first. Broadly, what do we know about when foreign policy matters in elections? Well, the answer is it depends a lot. There are some elections in which foreign policy in any country, the United States, France, India, Japan, is almost totally irrelevant. It shows up in party manifestos, it gets mentioned, as part of the standard stump speech, but surveys and patterns of political strategy suggest it's very, very limited influence in some elections. And I would suggest in most elections, in most countries, most of the time, foreign policy is kind of a background issue. It's one of the things you talk about as a matter of course, but generally not a major driver. That said, there are pretty important exceptions to that. So there are elections in which basically one of two things happens. One is there's some very salient pressing crisis or environment in which the foreign policy issues are just present for the public and among elites in a way that kind of is just structurally there. And so we can think of, for instance, in the United States in 2004, the war on terror, the Iraq War, these were just kind of everyday headline issues that were hard to completely ignore, right? And I think there have been periods in, Indian politics in which there are major crises with China, with Pakistan, that kind of can't be talked around entirely, that are present in the public mind, that are salient, and that create incentives and needs for politicians to at least try to address them, if only rhetorically, in some way. So let's call that a structural reason that foreign policy enters domestic politics. It kind of has to be dealt with. A related but different one is sometimes as a matter of politicians' strategy. When they say, I'm in trouble on some kind of dimension of politics, let's bring in foreign policy to try to kind of thwart that or build other advantages. And so this can be done by individual leaders who try to kind of cultivate like an individual brand. And I think Mrs. Gandhi is a very interesting example of that. So, there are these, when I teach my IR of South Asia class, I have these incredible photos from the 1970s and early 80s of Mrs. Gandhi in these kind of martial environments, her walking with, between rows of soldiers and kind of cultivating this, very clear image of toughness and strength. This also can be done by political parties. And I think the BJP in the last 10 years in particular has been very successful at kind of grabbing and maintaining the brand, right, of kind of tough on security, helping India rise. And some of that's linked to individual leaders, but also it's kind of part of the party's way of talking about itself. And so there's a structural version where in crises or high salient international contexts, competitions, US Cold War, sometimes India, Pakistan, India, China, but also this broader and more diffuse world of politician and leader strategy. And so the latter is harder to study because it's often more a matter of kind of choice and agency and strategy. And this election, we're going to play this up. The next election, let's play it down. So I think that sets up kind of, some ambivalence about what 2024 looks like, because, and, I'm going to just punt everything on 2024 to Milind. I don't study how Indians actually vote, but I have been studied how Indian politics, how the Indian public thinks about some key foreign policy issues. So I want to say one or two things before I move to that. For those who are interested, there are two kind of like comparative articles that might be interesting to think about India compared to other countries, and also India over time in terms of this relationship between politicians, the public, and foreign policy. And I'm happy to put stuff in the chat if I'm allowed to, or just email me if you're interested. One is by Susan Hyde and Elizabeth Saunders. That's basically trying to understand what are the constraints that democracies operate under. They published it in 2020, and they come up with this, what they call a malleable constraints framework, where some democracies sometimes are very constrained by the public, but some democracies are just not, at least on particular issues. So this depends on a whole variety of domestic political factors. Some authoritarian regimes are actually more constrained than you might think. They have to be responsive to the public. Other authoritarian regimes really are just, they kind of do whatever they want. And so that's a neat article. And then my co-author Vipin Narang and I have a 2018 article that mainly looks at India, but the goal is to like bring in lots of other cases. You can find that on my website. It's called, what is it called? Democratic Accountability in Foreign Security Policy, some extremely terrible title like that. Theory and Evidence from India. And so that's just a free PDF on my website for anyone who's interested, trying to think through some of these nitty-gritty dynamics in the Indian context. Okay, let me more briefly now talk about some of the data that we do have. The people who do the best surveys on Indian politics are the Indian domestic politics, elections, party, political behavior people, right? A problem is that at least historically, foreign policy wasn't consistently part of like the national elections survey, the national election study type surveys. And so we went back through a whole bunch of these really high quality, like CSDS type surveys, pops up occasionally, but there isn't a good kind of time series that's nationally representative going back to the 50s of public opinion. The US Information Agency, USIA, back in the day, funded the Indian Institute of Public Opinion to do regular surveys, what they call the International Images Survey, going back to the 1950s. And the international images really, we have mainly from the early 60s through the end of the Cold War. So every year or two, they'd send out survey teams to ask what Indians thought of both major other countries, that's the most consistent data, but also sometimes issues. Like is there a tension between getting nuclear weapons and Gandhian nonviolence? A lot of Indians were kind of like, oh, we can kind of have both in that response, going back to the 1960s and 1970s, actually. And so we've kind of compiled those and then mixed them with more recent survey data from places like Pew, Gallup, one-off surveys by a variety of both Indian and foreign firms to try to get a sense of some of the patterns here. And I just want to very briefly talk about some of those patterns, and then we can come back to them. One finding that I think will not be all that surprising is there's generally been fairly positive views of the USSR and Russia, and this, quite consistent during the Cold War. There's some changes post-Cold War, to be sure, but I think for, I don't know how many Americans are in the audience other than me. This is something that's very important to keep in mind. At the same time, opinion of the United States, other than this incredibly dramatic dip in the early 1970s, which is explained by US support for Pakistan and then kind of run up to and during the 1971 war, also Indian views fairly positive of the United States. And I on my blog, I kind of looked at a recent Pew survey. There's a lot of battles on Twitter about things involving US-India relations, but the Indian public generally has had a fairly positive view of the United States. One of the fun side things that they did a breakdown of what things Indians most like and dislike about the United States. Entertainment very low, universities very high, which is, the entertainment piece always amuses me. Just Indians are not as interested in American popular culture as a lot of other places, which I think is to India's credit. So India is a country that systematically, consistently has had positive views of both Russia and the United States. China is, and I think that has big implications, for how we think about current crises. Views of China, however, much unsurprisingly, much more negative consistently. I mean, the 60s, it's just down in single digits, and it slowly rises in the 70s and 80s. But in the last 10 years, we've seen another dip again in at least some of the publicly available survey data. So there are kind of these broad patterns in Indian foreign policy, public opinion. And then we did some more disaggregated analyses, and I'll just do quick hits on this. There have been toward China regional patterns, but not clear partisan patterns and views of China. That may have changed in recent years, but at least historically, kind of North India more hawkish than South India on the China question, partisanship actually having a very complicated and somewhat ambiguous relationship with that. A second thing is don't know response rates. And this gets to this question of kind of who is the foreign policy public? Like other countries, there's a clear kind of educational and class pattern to expressing opinions and surveys on foreign policy. Generally, not exclusively, but generally, like in the United States, like in lots of other countries, better educated, wealthier respondents just responding on foreign policy much more consistently than other socioeconomic categories. So I think there is a big Indian foreign policy public, but it's kind of class and education and biased in ways that are actually very similar to a lot of other countries. And we can talk about more stuff there that comes out of some of these data, but I think this provides at least a starting point for thinking about some of the factors that may be at play.
Thank you, Paul, for this sort of like laying the field of how foreign policy issues matter and when do they matter and what are like the dimensions in which they affect voting choices. And I think like just to add to what you were saying, in recent sort of like survey data, like most sort of like public opinion data, what we have questions only on trusting countries. And Indian voters, it seems they have consistently, so you talked about Russia and US positive rating, China recent times negative rating, and then what like Pakistan, another country, and obviously negative. And in my version, I don't see a lot of regional variations on some of these questions. But let me invite Milan, if you have anything to add, reflect on Paul's comments, but also to add from your own work with Jamie on 2019 elections, the Pulwama Balakot crisis, and how it might have played in the 2019 elections.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. That was excellent. Paul is mentioned his article, but he was, as usual, way too modest. The piece that Paul referenced, Democratic Accountability and Foreign Security Policy, that he co-authored with Vipin Narang, who will be known to many of you, is a really excellent framework to think about the conditions under which foreign policy might matter in domestic political context globally. But then embedded within that is sort of a case study thinking about India. And Paul and Vipin have one of those things that most of us who are political scientists always aspire to, but can never quite do, which is come up with this fabulous 2x2 matrix where everything is so neatly laid out. And just to kind of reframe or sharpen what Paul said, there are kind of two variables that they think are important. He mentioned salience, right? How salient is the foreign policy issue at hand, and how well defined is the clarity of responsibility, right? So you can imagine, for instance, a situation in which you have a very hodgepodge or messy coalition government, in which it's kind of hard if something goes wrong in the foreign policy domain. Who do you blame, right? Or on the flip side, if something goes well, who do you credit? And so they have this very nice sort of 2x2 where you can either have low salience or high salience issues, and the clarity of responsibility can either be low or high. So I think it's interesting to think about issues that could be in that high category, right? Issues that are both very salient and issues where the clarity of responsibility is unambiguous, right? And we're in a situation in the second party system, the second dominant party system, where the clarity of responsibility is very clear, right? And so in that context, I think it's just worth thinking about, like, how would we put the recent border incursions from China on Indian soil into this framework? Because I would argue it seems to be a very salient issue. There's been a huge backlash. As Paul mentioned, public opinion in India on China is quite poor. The government has taken steps to restrict investment, to ban apps like TikTok, and so on and so forth. The clarity of responsibility is also very high. And so, is this, which on its face seems like an embarrassment to the government, something which is going to provoke a response, right? And in thinking through that, just to kind of add to Paul and Vipin's framework, I was thinking through, what are some of the intervening variables that we might care about that could help determine whether this is, on net a good thing or a bad thing for the government? I think the first clearly is the credibility of the leader, right? And here, you can kind of think about the Modi factor, right? That Modi seems to retain a certain kind of credibility that even if this looks like an embarrassment on its face, there is some longer term strategy in place to somehow counter or counteract the Chinese sort of challenge, right? I think generally speaking, large swathes of the population seem to hold a belief akin to that. The second is about the information environment, right? How clear and permissive are the transmissions of communication about what has actually gone on at the border, right? And actually there, I'd argue it's fairly poor. We don't actually know a lot, at least if you read a lot of the Indian press. The government has been very reluctant to have an open debate in Parliament. You can seek out information from foreign policy experts, from geospatial imaging experts, and so on and so forth. But it's not really very front and center, right? And then the third variable, and I'm listing three that come top of mind, I'm sure there are many others Paul can add to the list, is the trust in the opposition, right? So like, even if you're able to circumvent hurdles number one, the credibility of the leader, and hurdle number two, the information environment, are we in a situation where people have a reasonable belief that the opposition would do better if their chosen leader were given the opportunity to be in the seat of power, right? So I think it's worth sort of thinking about kind of where we go from here if we agree that this is a kind of high salience, high clarity responsibility issue. Paul, I don't know if you want to come in on that, or I can keep going.
No, I mean, I think that's good. It's like some issue arises that people are at least somewhat interested in, but then it runs into these political structures, these informational dynamics, and that can generate a lot of ambiguity. It can cut in very different directions from, okay, there's a crisis. We think our incumbent leader is incompetent. Let's get him out of office. Versus there's a crisis. We trust this leader. We need to now stand with the nation against, kind of in a time of war or crisis or whatever. So the same shock can have these like diametrically different effects depending on some of these other conditions you're talking about.
I mean, I think, one of the things Rahul asked me to address was, what the lessons are from the 2019 election, right? Because I think the conventional wisdom among analysts maintains that, look, the BJP benefited electorally from the Pulwama-Balakot crisis, right? So it's important to remember what happened on February 14th of 2019. Terrorists attacked a CRPF convoy in Kashmir, killing 40 Jawans, which eventually led to Indian retaliation on terrorist training camps across the border in Pakistan, which was the first time in several decades, I believe, that you had Indian fighter jets actually bomb targets in not disputed but sovereign Pakistani territory. And this again, it was thought it created a kind of pretty massive rally around the flag effect. I mean, it's remembering, and Rahul would remember this better than any of us. Prior to the crisis, there were many reasons to believe that the BJP might actually struggle. Not that they wouldn't be the single largest party, but they might not do as well as they did in 2014, right? You had a slowing economy. You had 3 major state election defeats of the same states which we're going to polls right now. So there were real questions or doubts about the BJP. But then if you look at the polling evidence, right, it seems that this actually was pretty pivotal. So after remaining kind of steady in the weeks prior to the attack, support for Modi and the BJP soared by 20 percentage points in the weeks following Pulwama and Balakot, before partially reverting. That's according to C-Voter. If you look at the Lokniti CSDS pre-election survey, right, they found that 46% or so of the roughly 4/5 of their respondent pool, which had heard of the Balakot airstrike, supported Modi's re-election, compared to just 32% of respondents who had not heard. Similarly, voters who were the most concerned about terror attacks on Indian soil preferred Modi to Rahul Gandhi by 61 percentage points, right? I mean, just like a massive a gap between the two. Conversely, those who were most concerned about rising prices, economic welfare, preferred Rahul Gandhi to Modi, right? So it does suggest that if you take all of this together, that the crisis did divert attention to issues that most advantaged the BJP. Now, why was it so beneficial to the BJP? I think the answers are fairly obvious, right? I mean, the BJP mobilizes support by placing itself in direct opposition to an external enemy, in this case, Pakistan, right? That was engaged in hostile measures to undermine India's position. The BJP's election manifestos, its public statements, its kind of aura betray a much more hawkish foreign policy, say, than that of its principal rival, at least at the all India level, which is the Congress. And of course, the party has sort of had this steady drumbeat of claiming to be almost obsessed, I would say, with enhancing India's global stature, right? One of the signature kind of leitmotifs of the Modi era has been this determination to transform India from a balancing power into a leading power, right? So I think these are pretty clear and obvious things that happen at the macro level. But I think the situation is slightly more complicated. And here I just want to kind of build on some research that I published with a former colleague of mine who's now at Stanford, Jamie Hinson. What we found when we dug into this a little bit deeper is what we call the kind of macro-micro paradox. So at the macro level, Indians seemed across the country to rally behind the BJP in the wake of Pulwama and the subsequent strikes at Balakot. But if you actually look at a micro level, there's evidence of a blowback. So what do I mean by that? What we decided to do was look just at Uttar Pradesh, which had 12 CRPF Jawans who passed away and were killed in the Pulwama attacks. Each of these people came from a village where there was a large funeral procession that served as a social commemoration of this attack and what happened that day. And what we found is actually that the BJP's vote share decreases with proximity to where those processions took place, right? Especially in places where the BJP is incumbent. So let me reframe that a different way. The mobilization of collective anger after the crisis actually dampened rather than enhanced the rallying in favor of the BJP, right? So just to put a number on this, so if you were in a village that was 2 kilometers from where a Pulwama funeral procession took place, you saw a 6 percentage point reduction in the BJP's vote share compared to a village that was just 20 kilometers away, right? These are villages which look almost exactly identical on any kind of observable variable, right? So the vote swings in favor of the BJP were systematically weaker near the epicenters of the kind of Pawama funeral processions. Now, what's the point of all this? We know that the BJP won in a landslide, and we know that they won UP in a landslide. So does any of this really matter if we find these micro effects, right? And I think for us, we sort of had three lessons. I think the first is that I think clearly the consensus around rallying around the flag is a bit more tenuous than we thought, right? So imagine what would be the situation if 400 soldiers had been killed instead of just 40, right? Would the commemoration of those losses mobilized far more citizens to question the government rather than to increase the ranks of BJP supporters, right? So that's something to think about for the future. The second is that terrorism and other security crises can have consequences in places, even where national security is often thought as a kind of elite issue, right? It's conventional wisdom, and this is a question I want to ask Rahul, that both 2611 and the Kargil War, which preceded general elections just by a few months, didn't necessarily impact voting behavior. But I wonder if we dug a little bit deeper, Rahul, I know at some point you were working on this, would we find a more complicated relationship? And last but not least, and I'll just end here, I think the third lesson that we took away from this is that even nationalist governments face a very real trade-off in figuring out how or whether to exploit security crises for political leverage, right? So on the one hand, it makes sense to mobilize collective anger. It could sort of, again, whip up this nationalist sentiment, but it could also backfire, even for the most secure kind of hawkish governments, right? So that's a little bit about what I think we know about 2019 and some of the nuances that were kind of underneath the macro story.
Thank you, Milan. Let me add to the question you asked in the end about the Kargil. What I remember from so what we try to do is look at 96, 98, and 99 election surveys conducted by Lokniti CSDS. And we do find sort of evidence of rally around the flag, which is basically what happens during a rally around the flag, that you would see the leadership popularity rating going up, and two other sort of like concerns such as related to economy, those will go down, which had also happened in 2019. For example, in 2018 survey conducted by Lokniti CSDS, there were 67% of people who had said that they are having a difficulty in finding a job. That number came down in a pre-poll survey in March by sort of like 52 or 53. So there was 3 or 4 indicators of that kind: a difficulty in finding a job, income not sufficient to meet the ends, dissatisfaction with the NDA government. On all those 3 things, in that like a period of 8 to 10 months, there was a decline in favor of BJP, right? So there is some sort of like movement of rally around the flag effect, both in 2019 as well as in the 98 Kargil crisis. I think the more important and interesting analysis, which we have not been able to do, is to figure out what actually like was driving those choices. Because in the survey, we had 3 different kinds of questions. One is related to India testing the nuclear bomb, right? The atom bomb. The second one is to do with the Kargil insurgency and the war there. And third one is to deal with the underlying Hindutva sentiment. Because the like ideologically, the Hindu nationalism project is not just on the religious conservatism side, but it also brings the national sentiments together. Is it just heightening making salience of nationalist identity within a small subsection of the population, or is it basically going in a larger segment of population? That's one concern. And the second, I think what might have happened, and if we had better sort of like data to analyze this, is my hunch is that BJP actually managed to gain two things in the 1990s, which we have not analyzed so far. The BJP actually in 1990s becomes what in the sort of like this kind of literature you call as issue reputation kind of thing. BJP pre-1990s, I don't think had a great reputation on the question of national security. That would be Congress, Indira Gandhi's position. I think the ongoing terrorist attacks in Jammu and Kashmir in the early part of 90s, and then BJP's decision to sort of like do the nuclear test, and then the war with Kargil, and then the 2001 parliament attack, and then the subsequent mobilization. I think that entire decade basically gave these BJP a different kind of reputation on the nationalism and national security question. Two, what it did is basically broaden the BJP's base. I would broaden the BJP's base from largely upper caste Hindu urban population to a slightly more what you'll call as plebeinization of BJP that begins in the late 90s and early 2000s. I think this is one of the major factors that drove it. I don't have sort of like, clinching evidence to make this claim. Otherwise, I would have sent the paper. But yeah, that's what I think is happening. But before I bring in Paul and Milan for another round of short comments, I would request our friends in audience to please put your questions or comments on Q&A box. Both Milan and Paul can look them and weave them in their answers, or just comment on online. I think, Paul, so let me ask you this, which is drawing on Milan's version of how some of these national security issues might basically get played in both directions. And even nationalist governments, or what you'll call as conservative right-wing parties, are not always clear if it's always going to work in their favor. But the literature, at least to my knowledge, and I may be wrong on this, is that rally around the flag is going to favor conservative parties much more because they carry, like they have a issue position and hold issue reputation on that thing. Is that not correct? That's first point. Second, Paul, given and the reason why I wanted to do this conversation is not just because of like Modi's attempt to project India's image using G20 presidency and everything. In fact, in an online poll which we do with YouGov a couple of months back, we had asked a question, and I'll just read out the answers from that question. So we gave people three options. What do you think? The question was, what do you think led to India assuming the G20 presidency this year? Right. And the three options were, it's on a rotational basis and it was India's turn, so nothing special about it. Second option was, India's G20 presidency shows how Modi's foreign policy agenda is raising India's global stature. And third was, G20 is an irrelevant body and it doesn't matter, or I haven't heard about India's G20 presidency. I combined those things. Supporters of BJP and NDA, like 63% of them chose that India's G20 presidency is raising India's stature. In comparison, the Congress, that number was half, around 33%. And they were much more likely to say that G20 is an irrelevant body, or it's just on a rotational basis, so it doesn't matter. So my question is to you is, how can something like this be weaved into a sort of like campaign platform in the run-up to 2024?
Great. Well, these are great questions. Let me start with the first. So who wins rallies around the flag? I think So I think generically, yes, kind of nationalist parties, governments that are kind of say they're tough on security, generically, you might expect them to win on average from rallies around the flag. I think we have to be careful, though, because crises, and I want to kind of shout out, Tanvi has a nice breakdown of different ways of thinking about foreign policy. And the first one I think is most relevant would be a specific crisis or event. Think about the Netanyahu government, right? Comes to power, and he has been as hawkish and a hardline as you get on Israel-Palestine issues. He's now incredibly unpopular in the wake of a major crisis. Why is that? Because responsibility and blame. He was in charge when it happened, and the events, second, are deeply dissonant with all of the claims and the branding of his party, right? So it's not that the Israeli this leader is now reaping these electoral rewards from a crisis. Instead, he's being blamed. Incompetent, unable to protect Israel, his particular ideological project has distracted Israel from its true security interests around the judicial crisis, all of that stuff. So I think we have to be careful, right? Now, there's an additional point there, which is sometimes it's not clear who is to blame and whether a crisis is someone's fault. And that's where I think kind of clever politicians or rhetoricians, and I use spin in a non-pejorative way, they can spin ambiguous things to their advantage to say, well, this is a crisis, it's a danger, but it's not our fault, and we're the best ones to solve it. And so I think there's a range of crises where kind of skillful politicians can weave that balance, right? I mean, think about George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, right? Security failing on his watch, and yet he's able to kind of say, well, we weren't really given sufficient warning. There was no reason for these people to attack us. Why would we expect it? So I think there's a lot of variation in who benefits from rally around the flag attack efforts. And a lot of that comes down to how clear is the blame and the responsibility, and how does it match with your party brand or show, kind of undermine or clash with it. On the second point, I think one thing we've learned, and you know this much better than me, right? Because you're in this world of public opinion and mass sentiment. Political attachments, among other attachments, can deeply shape how people understand the world around them. And at least in the US case, and I don't know if this is how widely true this is, but in the US case, the best educated are also the most partisan and the most ideological, right? Very rigid kind of worldviews that all kind of match together. And so people understand the world, they interpret information often in fundamentally different ways, depending on party identification, race, class, region, depending on the context, a whole bunch of things kind of filter the world. And so it's not surprising to me at all that kind of people who identify with different parties will kind of understand the underlying causes of these foreign policy events in very, very different ways, right? And I think that's very consistent with literature from all over the place, right? So I think one important thing about these conversations is not to kind of say India is unique in some of these factors, right? I think the specifics and the context are obviously very different with huge implications, but kind of some of these basic patterns, I think, are generically shared, especially in places where party identification is relatively strong. And my sense is, Rahul and Milan, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but party identification has grown somewhat clearer in the last decade than in 1996. And so I think that brings with it kind of understanding of the world and how to interpret reality in ways that are going to vary across partisan lines.
Thank you, Paul. Milan, do you have anything to respond, or should we take some of the questions that's on the Q&A?
Well, let me try to weave in some of the comments and questions, and I think Tanvi's point about the different categories of devants are interesting, right? So you have a specific event or crises. There's something that contributes to the general hava, right? The general mood, which maybe the G20 fits into that category, and then some kind of global or regional event that affects economic dynamics. One of the things that I struggle to think about as we head into the 2024 campaign is this larger question, right, of how much does foreign policy matter? Not because of specific incidents, but for some of these other reasons, particularly the second category that Tanvi mentions, right? And I feel like an important concept that we haven't yet come to grips with in this context of foreign policy is this idea of status seeking, right? So we tend to think a lot about the importance of status seeking when it comes to caste mobilization, to community mobilization in our domestic political analyses. But not so much when it comes to our foreign policy analyses. I think that's true in India and it's true in the United States, right? Like there's a terrific book, which I would commend to all of you, by Rohan Mukherjee, on status, particularly amongst rising powers. And there's some fabulous stuff in there on India and China in particular, and how they look at international organizations, right? And it's you know, he makes the point in the book that India has long emphasized its civilizational exceptionalism, its great power status, but it's never been accorded, or not in recent memory, that kind of status at the global high table, right? And I think this government has clearly expressed this desire. It's taken steps to project an image that India has, quote unquote, finally arrived. And my sense of it is that this really resonates with a wide swath of Indians who have aspirations for India in a domestic context that are also matched in an external context as well, right? And so we come back to this point of, you know, this traditional separation which we've had between elite issues and mass issues in Indian politics. And, you know, clearly in my mind, we're seeing a breakdown of that separation. Somehow foreign policy has seeped into the mass category, but in a way that's incredibly hard to quantify or describe, right? But I think most of us would agree that if you go back to 2019, even if you leave aside Pulwama and Balakot, it was striking to see the number of ordinary voters who talked about this idea that India's arrived, that because of Modi ji, India was respected, and, you know, every world leader had to, you know, take their time to kind of back down from a position or pay their respects. And so it's not a easily measurable determinant of voter behavior, but somehow needs to be fed into our broader calculations of that kind of hava, that feel good, you know, feeling.
No, Milan, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I'll just sort of like add a sentence, and if you have any reflections on this, which is, I think we all agree that something has changed in last 10 to 15 years, where some of these issues have creeped into mass politics as well, and it's no longer a concern of merely elite politics. And it has largely, so the question is, even if we are not able to measure what is driving this change, is it what Paul mentioned, and you also touched upon, about leaders' credibility and ability of a politician to use rhetorical devices to convert these sort of like elite issue into a language which masses can sort of like associate with? Or is it to do with the changing nature of how information is consumed? So coming of social media and 24-hour, 24/7 channels, where much of the conversation, you know, like the global conversations on conflicts and everything are being sort of like driven down. Or third is basically what I'll call as upward mobility within the Indian society, where many more people are going to study or work abroad, and they have this aspiration that if India, like their passport is respected, that means they will also get respected. And that, so what is driving this kind of change, or it's everything together and we don't know?
I mean, I guess my inclination is everything together, right? These things are all happening simultaneously. I will say the informational environment is radically different than, you know, if you read about the 1960s, right? In which it's just the levels of literacy, access, rapid immediate access to media and information is just very fundamentally different than in a number of these past contexts, not just in India, but in the rest of the world as well. So I mean, even just kind of simple indicators like literacy rates have changed dramatically over time as well, right? And so some of these things that I think previously were thought of kind of elite high politics issues, right, are just much more accessible in a variety of ways. And both for that reason and for their own other reasons, politicians grab onto these things. And it's not that this is all unique and different. I mean, Mrs. Gandhi was doing some of this and in his own way, right, or in her own way back in the 70s. But I think that the reach is much, much broader. Just one methodological point here, and this kind of comes into something in the questions, is some of these are going to be long-term processes. So Rahul, your story about the broadening of the BJP and the rise of its brand, right, I think makes a lot of sense. But then the BJP lost two big national elections, right? And so it's going to be hard for scholars, I think, and for analysts and even for politicians to kind of draw these short-term linkages, like crisis in this year, electoral outcome in this year, because there's both these moments, but then these underlying tectonic plates as parties are kind of looking around and trying to reposition themselves. New leaders are coming up with new ideas about how to do this. Other parties are collapsing, right? So if you look at the communists during the Cold War, it's very interesting, like how are they positioning India in the global Cold War, and China-Soviet splits, and all this just becomes almost totally irrelevant, kind of like that. Right? And that whole brand collapses to a certain extent. So I think it's a challenge for a lot of us, whether kind of citizens or scholars or analysts or whatever, to figure out what this thing is doing is this latent background variable that has these long-term effects, but also kind of becomes really salient in these particular moments, but then might disappear for 10 years.
No,
So
sorry, go ahead.
No, just to kind of reiterate, but maybe slightly different way. I mean, it seems like there are three variables here that are very important, right? When we think about the answer to your question, Rahul. I mean, one is that clearly there is a shift in the broader structure of geopolitics and international order that has produced a situation in which India's value and its worth is all of a sudden risen, right? So it's declining unipolarity, it's a rising China, it's what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, a whole host of factors, which all of a sudden India is at the center of everybody's attention, right? So that's a tremendous opportunity for the country and for this government. Then that is met with a political leader who has recognized that opportunity and has tried to exploit it for not just international prestige, but also domestic political advantage, right? It's not as if previous prime ministers, Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, hadn't reached out to the diaspora and thought about it. But nobody really thought to say, let's go to Houston, Texas, and fill a football stadium with 55,000 adoring Indian Americans, right? For that matter, there are other world leaders who could possibly do that. Not many, but maybe some. But very few think of it, right? So it's a combination, I think, of the structure of the agency, and then, as Paul mentioned, I think the delivery mechanism is really crucial here, right? This combination of technology, of direct communication, of the creation of political spectacle. I mean, I was struck, Rahul, almost a year ago when we were in Delhi together, and it was December 1st, which was the first day of India's G20 presidency. And anybody who had an Indian mobile phone got a text message from their cell phone provider saying, something along the lines of, this is an auspicious day. It's a time for all Indians to celebrate. India is assuming the G20 presidency. And you look out the window and you see Humayun's tomb, and you see the lotus flower logo. I mean, it was really something that is almost boggles the mind in terms of everything that went into that, right? So I feel like it's an interaction between these three factors.
No, thank you, Milan. Something which has been just sort of put by Professor Gopa Kumar on the Q&A box, and I was also thinking about this question, that for last 50 minutes, our conversation has focused on national politics and national elections. Something to think about, not just like, of course, there are going to be regional variations. If you are in Tamil Nadu, Sri Lanka and relations with Sri Lanka would matter, right? And if you are in West Bengal or the northeastern states, then relations with Myanmar and Bangladesh would matter a little bit more. Or China, if you are in Arunachal, Sikkim, and those kind of region and western border. So there are, of course, going to be regional issues. But like, do these kind of concerns of foreign policy or national security, can they play up in assembly elections at any point of time? Of course, it would matter on leaders and their ability to derive. But do we have any evidence of, in the past, anyone, even in the audience, if they know and want to point us out in that direction, if we have enough evidence of national security issues playing in assembly elections? And the second question, someone actually put this on the Q&A box, is like, how do we define what is a national security issue? The crisis in Manipur, it is a security issue, but do we sort of like call it a national security issue affecting the entire sort of like Indian landscape, or is it going to be just a concentrated thing? Anyone, Paul, Milan?
So on assembly elections, that's kind of not, I don't know a whole lot about this. And so I want to tread extremely carefully, but I will say that the 1972, there were a set of state assembly elections in 1972 that Mrs. Gandhi won, the Congress won more than 70% of, right? And part of this was in 72, this was after the 71 war. At least people like the Rudolphs have argued that this was kind of an effect and in some sense kind of an outcome of the 71 war, that these issues were salient. I can't speak to that, but that's at least how sometimes these elections are framed or portrayed. I do think that at least historically, there have been regional differences in views of major powers. And I take your point, and this is why I said in recent years, views of China may now be nationalizing, they may be converging. But at least in the previous survey data, there are clear, consistent across multiple different surveys over different time period, regional differences in views of China. Also, and this is very impressionistic, but in the Indian Institute of Public Opinion data, so South India, basically it's very non-representative. Oh, sorry, this is very non-representative, but Calcutta, so basically they take 4 big cities. So Madras, Chennai, Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta. And you see this divergence over the course of the 60s and 70s, while Calcutta ends up kind of swinging left and, South India, like very buttoned down, US, kind of not necessarily pro-US per se, but very much not pro-Soviet. Very impressionistic. There's surveys in cities, like we want to be careful. But I do think, at least historically, there have been differences in kind of which parts of the country view some of these major powers. And I think a lot of that is through domestic lenses as well, right? Kind of parties, ideologies. And I'll be curious in the years to come whether there's also these questions of economics that have come up in the chat of kind of different sectors that are more or less integrated with the global economy, more or less tied to particular supply chains, whether that at the level of either mass politics or interest group politics kind of affects outlook toward different powers for political economy reasons.
Milan, there's a question by Diogo, and I think both of you can reflect on this one by one, which is like in the US context and in other countries, we have seen politicians when they are talking, when they're campaigning, they do talk about foreign policy questions, right? Whereas I don't know if Indian politicians do that a lot during campaigns. So now, of course, they're going to talk about India's image and all those kind of things. But sort of like critical foreign policy questions are not part of election campaigning. And I'm not sure, I can look this up, whether party manifestos dedicate a lot of space to foreign policy issues. So the question is that we've been thinking about sort of like from one angle, which is whether foreign policy saved domestic politics, but what would be the other way around? Are there sort of like concerns in domestic politics that shapes foreign policy priorities of different parties and different leaders? Are they sort of like trying to cater to some constituencies in the Indian case, or these are still distinct in sort of like what we think of elite politics versus mass politics?
So I'll offer impressionistic thoughts. First, every party I've gone through a lot of these manifestos, and there's always something about foreign policy in there, but it varies dramatically in the level of detail and specificity. Sometimes it's like a page that you could have had ChatGPT generate, like, we want India to be strong and respected in the world, next page. Others are kind of, much more detailed. So I think there are some party differences, right? I mean, especially between national parties and regional parties. In terms of constituencies, I think there are a few different ways to think about this. And this isn't my area, but for people who are interested, there has been research on this. So just send me an email. One that I know the least, but is obviously really important, is around kind of sectoral and regional economic interests. Right. This is especially around trade openness. So some of this is public opinion, but also some of it is kind of who are dominant industries, or who are major political players in particular sectors of the country. So Asima Sinha has his book on regionalism and globalization in India, for those who are interested. So that's one kind of constituency, kind of openness versus closure, foreign direct investment. What are the terms, right? And so I don't know anything about it, but I know it's important. A second you could think about is linkage to domestic political ideologies. Right. So in the Cold War, you had kind of a non-alignment and Congress and kind of this idea of Indian nationalism. The BJP now has its kind of a linkage of what it means for India to be a global power with what it means for India to be domestically strong, domestically successful. The communists had this, and they had like 17 versions of it, depending what year we're talking and which communists we're talking about. But there's very clear effort to kind of use foreign policy or deploy foreign policy as part of a domestic vision, right? And to play to the party's strengths domestically. So that could involve questions of region, it could involve questions of class, it could involve questions of religion. But these things, I think, can be fused together in some very interesting ways that are not about foreign policy per se. They're about like, what is the India we want at home, which then we suggest has some relationship to how India should act and how it will be viewed externally, right? So I guess that's another way of thinking about some of these linkages here.
Okay, Milan?
Yeah, I mean, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2019, the Congress did issue a foreign policy manifesto, right? That retired General Huda authored. And I would suspect that that is going to be more of a trend. In the same way that now we're seeing the rumblings of the government of India preparing its first national security strategy, right? So I think that we're going to see more of a trend towards codifying some of these things as the blurring of the lines between elite and mass politics take place. The second is, these are just impressions, but I'm struck by the extent to which the government and actually the party, namely the BJP, seems to be using the external affairs minister as a rallying point for domestic political consumption. And that to me does seem very new and different, right? Getting invited to address party workers in a particular state, right? Many of his infamous one-liners have gone viral and have been shared on social media channels. So that does strike me as something somewhat new and particular to this government. I do think that there is clearly evidence of domestic interests shaping foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the question of international economics and trade, right? I mean, we recall that India was at the trade negotiating table to finalize RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, until literally the 11th hour, when it decided to withdraw. Claiming that this was going to be a Trojan horse for Chinese companies essentially to dump very cheap exports into India, and that would decimate kind of nascent industry, right? And I think business groups, important conglomerates, unions all had a role to play. And even more broadly than that, I think, we've seen a real movement away from pushing for multilateral trade liberalization or even regional trading agreements towards bilateral FTAs, right? And I think part of the way to understand that is bilateral FTA, say India-UK free trade agreement, is something that could be negotiated in such a way that India doesn't have to sign up to across-the-board concessions, but can make sure that strategically important and domestically politically important sectors can be protected, right? And of course, this can't be fully dissociated from its desire to promote national champions and so on and so forth, right? So for me, I think that's probably the most obvious place where we've seen a real impact.
Thank you, Milan. Paul and Milan, both of you, last words or any thoughts or comments or hypotheses that you might have thought, and then we'll close the conversation.
Well, maybe just a couple of quick hits from the Q&A, if that's okay. Just things that jumped out at me a little. And I'd recommend people read the Q&A. It's really thoughtful comments. Thank you. So one question is, in this informational environment, can anybody spin anything to make anything salient, right? And this is something I wrestle with because I think the answer is probably no, I think, because I think it's hard to get people to care about things they fundamentally don't care about, right? I mean, I'm just thinking if in American politics, some enterprising politician said, I'm going to mobilize anti-Malawi sentiment. Like probably they could figure out some way to do that. Like these brown outsiders are coming to America to take our stuff, but like it probably would have a lot more trouble. So I would guess that there's like a gradient of spinability. right? And there's something between like the underlying actual importance of the issue to the electorate and then the rhetorical skill and power of the spinner. But there's just going to be some issues that are much harder than others, I think, right? And that should give us at least some sense of which issues are more likely to be important and which are less likely. There's a question also about kind of regional politics and how they interact with kind of security issues, whether it's, in the Northeast regarding Myanmar or, Punjab with regard to Pakistan. And I think I've thought about this in the Sri Lankan case with, which I've studied Sri Lanka, but it's relevant to South India. Like, I think that's an open research area. We don't know that much about it. Kind of when do state level politics, how are they affected by the kind of spillover, right? And sometimes they are, but sometimes that doesn't matter nationally at all. And sometimes it does. And is that just simply a matter of, is the state party in a national coalition, or what else is going on there? And I don't have a good answer to that, but I think it's a really interesting question to think about, especially if we think about kind of spillover from Myanmar's crisis in the Northeast and kind of the general reorientation of the politics in the Northeast over the last 15 years. But I guess my final, point is this is an area that I think we don't know that much about, but I think we agree is important, and we need more people like those in the audience to do research on it. So it's a really live kind of research issue, but also obviously a really important political and policy one.
Thank you, Paul. Milan?
Thanks. Tanvi just pointed out that that not everyone can see, I think, the Q&A. So I don't know if this can be like we can see it, but I don't know if everyone else can see it. So maybe it's possible to save it. It would make for just a really interesting tweet thread to just tweet some questions or issues that were out there just for people who want to do research on this. Rahul, I leave that to you to create some work. Two reflections. There was a question about Manipur and whether that it's clearly a national security issue. Does it have any impact? My very sad assessment is I don't think so. Outside of the state of Manipur, maybe, in neighboring states, I'm not sure that it is going to resonate nationally, in part because it is seen by a single state issue. And also, unfortunately, the Northeast always traditionally gets underplayed both in the public consciousness as well as the media, which is a sad reality. But I'm not sure how much that connects. But even if you take an issue like Kashmir, for example, and the abrogation of Article 370, there were many people who thought maybe that would have broader national ramifications, right? And I'm not convinced it has. I mean, even among opposition parties who are nominally fighting for states' rights, they too did not necessarily create much of an outcry around the nullification of 370, right? So if it didn't happen there, it's hard to see whether it would happen beyond that. One final thing, just again, as an open question to think about is, in this current environment, with a single party majority, with the information environment being what it is, the spin capacity what it is, what does the opposition do? Right? What is the opposition? I think it's worth thinking about. I mean, I can think of two things as partial responses. One is, I think continuing in the vein of 2019 and being very clear about what your national security strategy is and how that might differ from the incumbent is probably worth doing to try to assume some credibility on those issues. But the second is, and I think this is maybe controversial, I think is also there are times when you have to limit your criticism, right? I would just refer everybody to a really fantastic and very snarky Hindustan Times essay by Prashant Jha, in which he sort of calls out the hypocrisy of the opposition and the foreign policy analyst class for arguing one thing, and then when that one thing happens and arguing the other side. One of the examples I recall was many people who said it would be a massive embarrassment for this government if it weren't able to successfully negotiate a G20 communique of the G20 heads of state, and of course it was able to do that. And then once it did that, the next line was, oh, but you had to water down your language on X, Y, or Z. And so I do think that has the potential to backfire, and which is, so there's strategically actually acknowledging every once in a while the government does something good. It might be in their long-term interests.
Thank you, Milan. In just to sort of conclude, in last 8 sort of like conversation, I tried to summarize what the conversation was and what we should do next, at least on that topic. Today, I'm not going to attempt even doing that, because what I learned from this conversation is how much we don't know. We actually like began the conversation that there's not a lot of work on this topic. We actually don't have a papers in even double digits to be able to say that this is how sort of like foreign policy, national security questions, public opinion, and voting behavior in the Indian or developing countries context can be linked. But thank you, Milan and Paul. This was very, very useful in a way that I have now some ideas what 4 or 5 things we are missing to actually begin a kind of a agenda paper or a research paper. And as Paul said, hopefully some of the people in audience and those who might listen to this later on, the younger folks, will pick up some of the questions and inform us how it matters and when it matters in the Indian context. So thank you so much, Paul and Milan, for taking time out, and everybody who joined us today and stayed for this evening. Tune into this conversation. We'll have a couple of more events lined up, one later this month. I still need to figure out the topic, but we will definitely have like the 11th edition, which is on December 4th, dissecting the state results that will come on December 3rd. So thank you again, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.